Greetings, folks. I'm glad that you picked this topic to look at, of my own personal experience of the healing path. Originally, I didn't want to think this way or go this direction, but then it dawned on me, wait a minute. The only thing that I have to give away to you is my own experience of the healing state, of the path of getting there. And it's legitimate. It's my testimony to it. And so I decided I'm going with that in this aspect of our YouTube topics. When people come to meetings, I run meetings. By the way, I'm retired, and this is all volunteer work. And so people for the first time come to meetings, and there was a meeting the other day in which there were 3 people who came, and I wondered how to start off with them. What is it that they need? What's this first step that I had to go through? And I thought of myself and all the years of my tracing the healing and my looking for what worked and putting aside what doesn't work. And I remember the feeling of a lostness inside myself. And I thought, okay, how did you ever deal with that? How did you deal with the fact that you didn't know the answers, didn't have answers? Here I was suffering from anxiety states. Here I was suffering from this feeling of walking around all the time with a I haven't got it kind of feeling, always looking for a support from others to fill that kind of state, or a support in activities that I was going through to support the state. But what I did not have was a sense of a me. And if I would have been asked about that, I would never have known how to be able to answer it. And I looked at this kind of thing, that this not knowing who I was, but to the point I wouldn't even have known how to answer it if you would have asked me, who do you think you are? Would have had no idea of discussing this kind of an issue, or how you got here, or what's the meaning of your life. These things just did not exist in the emptiness, in the vagaries of my feeling of who I am and who I feel I'm not, didn't exist. And to such an extent that I never would have raised that question with anybody else. And I wouldn't have even known to raise that question. It was so blanked out, so blotted out, this whole area of identity, that I wouldn't even have known to bring it up with anybody. And I would have been so self-conscious and so ashamed of this feeling of weakness that was there, that I would never have discussed it, would not have ever talked about this with others. Now that's the original state that I was in. And I thought, how did you deal with that? And I started to look back. I mean, how'd you live with this kind of thing, Robert? What did you do? How could you get through this kind of thing? And the answer to it was that I would just do what the world put in front of me and believe that's what you're supposed to do. So I go to school, and you're supposed to study, and you're supposed to get good grades, and this was a measure of who I was. It was in a doing aspect. It wasn't in a reflective or philosophical, a mulling of personal identity. It's go along with the world And would I have been able to say that I was going along with the world? No, I would not have done it because I didn't know what I was doing. I just didn't know. I'm just a human being who comes into this world and now is going to act the way the world is going to direct me. The world is going to influence me, and I'm going to go with it. And so go to school, get good grades, go out after school, play handball. I grew up in New York City, and handball was my favorite kind of sport. And to indulge all of these things, doing, get a job after school, doing. And this was the extent that I existed from. Go do whatever is put in front of you. And I stayed with this philosophy until I was 53 years old, that I simply did accomplish, try to accomplish, come up with something and go out and do it. Never asking, though, what was the relationship of myself in this world? How did I get here? Who am I? What's it all about? Is there an afterlife? All of these things would be blotted out until, on occasion, I would need to face it. And how would I face it? Well, for instance, about the idea of death. Now, I realize that even at the age of 7 or so, I was concerned about death and that what happens. And I solved it for myself by simply thinking that I would be in a coffin with my mother and father. They would be on either side of me, and so I wouldn't be lonesome. I would be with somebody. That lonesomeness. And that was the end of it, was going to settle it. That this would be the solution. That there would be somebody who would uphold me. And again, this is this human state, that we are not at peace with inside of ourselves, but we look outside of ourselves for things to be able to hold us together and to give us some sort of going from day to day. And that's what I did. And it doesn't work. It did not, it could not work, because there was no stability to it. The human mind isn't stable. The human mind creates civilizations that are not stable. The human mind lives in a physical world that's not stable. And yet, I could not look at this and say, what do you do about it? And as I got older, I became aware into my 20s that this world did not have a safety to it. There was nothing that you could do that could ward off the instability of the world, that the world was going to eventually do you in, would eventually give you circumstances that you just couldn't deal with because they're not dealable with in a safe way, except to go look in the world with what the world says, do this, and keep going with that kind of circumstance. Now, question, am I talking about you? Is this me that I'm talking about? This wandering through an experience of thinking that this is life, of wandering through it and just doing what everybody else does and try to be able to get to a point that you have security within myself and within yourself. Is this something that is meaningful to you? Because eventually I had to be able to deal with it. So as part of this process of going along and doing what the world wants you to do, one of the things is, of course, that you're supposed to get married, and I proceeded in the path of, I had a very lovely friend who I had as a fiance at that time, and I was in law school, I remember, at the time. And on the one hand, I haven't got the slightest idea of how to be able to study within the study of law, had no idea of how to take exams, of what to do with it, where would it lead, no sense of the organization of the materials to study. And so I am threatened with the fact that I can't do. And indeed, I dropped out of law school. And now I have this very dear person who I'm engaged with, and I'm still walking along with no sense of just, you're supposed to get married and find somebody that you can like. And here was the next person that was now entering into my life who I would want to be able to support myself through her liking me and making me feel I'm doing what's right. And then she broke the engagement. Thank God she did. Bless her heart. Thank God she broke the engagement and pointed out that she herself was going to go into counseling, and she questioned whether or not I would be able to do that. Would I get there? And I humphed and thumped, oh really? And that also drove me into looking for counseling, because somebody challenged me on it, and I would now be a doer in that sense. Now that's the introduction to this topic of how we're doing on this path of learning, that I did not know how lost I was, did not know how to look at it, simply joined in with the world to go ahead and get your middle-class home and have a family and a car, and after that, what else is there but that this is the meaning of the American way of life, that this is what it is, to guarantee everybody that home and a place in the middle class. That's it. Well, let's pause at this point and catch our breath. Part 2 of what life was like for me as I go along. I pointed out in Part 1 that I became a follower of the world, that whatever the world does, to go do it, and do it the best I can, with no sense of why you do this, why not, except that this is what the world dictates, and that's what you do. And so I proceeded in life to try to accomplish this kind of a thing, to pass tests, to go on to college, to go on to graduate school, etc. And I followed that path. But I had been thrown into seeking for counseling. There was something in me which saw that nothing was working. I had pulled out of law school, and my fiance pulled out of the relationship, and now I was facing the fact that I wasn't doing what I thought I should be doing. I wasn't doing what I had set up, not even knowing I had set it up, but what I believed was you go through life being successful at whatever it is you go try to do. For what reason? Wouldn't have had a reason. For some ideal, didn't have an ideal. Just keep going and doing what you're doing, and that throws me into counseling. And even the early aspects of counseling, because I went to see 3 different people, 2 who were psychologists and 1 who was a psychiatrist, very, very lovely people, and still was on this doing aspect. But now, since I'm in counseling, well, that's what I should do, and become a counselor. And so I go into graduate school. I left law school and go into graduate school in order to become a psychologist, because I was influenced by the fact that I'd seen 2 psychologists and a psychiatrist, and so this path was what I wanted to follow, to be a helper. But how to be of help? Well, do what you experience your 3 teachers as doing, as to what they say to be able to do, and did not yet have a sense until I was 33. Now, I went into therapy when I was 23. Until I was 33, I did not have a sense of the ultimate answers to what is our meaning, who are we, why are we here. Did not have a sense of this kind of an approach. Instead, it was this constant doing. In graduate school, take your courses, be able to do in them, listen to what they're teaching you, and I thought that within this is what it's all about. Never got to the point of saying, who am I and what is my purpose in this world based on who am I. I only know I'm training to be able to help people. And this is the extent. And didn't know that this was the extent. Did not know how to replace it with anything else. And until 33, when the psychiatrist who I was going with had an aneurysm that happened which interfered with our continuing with each other, I simply could not find why are these anxiety attacks here. And he would assure me that they were caused by something like, when I asked him at one time, but what's causing these attacks? He said, you didn't know? And I said, no. And he was a Freudian. And he said, it's your cleft lip, which in my day we call it a hair lip. And I'm still comfortable calling it a hair lip, but okay, it's a cleft lip. He said, that's the reason. And I looked at him, that's the reason for it. And I couldn't catch on. And he became ill shortly after that. And now I was not in therapy with him. And I began to look about for what could be behind this kind of thing. And very fortunately, at this time, people had entered into my practice who had a spiritual orientation, and they brought to my awareness Edgar Cayce, who was known as the Seer of Virginia Beach, and I read some of Edgar Cayce's work, and that he was a healer, and I wanted now to have the powers that Edgar Cayce had, because he came from a mystical end, and that he prayed, and from this praying, from putting his head on the Bible, this would somehow or other bring answers to him, and he was widely known and widely respected. And I read some of his stuff, but couldn't apply it to myself because I had no orientation towards Bible or this kind of a thing. But I wanted the powers that Edgar Cayce had, that a person would come and I would be able to see them as Edgar Cayce saw them. And the approach that I would look with people is the approach that had been used with me by my three teachers, of just looking at what was troubling me and using reason to get yourself out of what it was that was plaguing you and to see the irrationality of it, but not to be able to get to the point yet of saying, okay, why does it exist in the first place? And this would be the required aspect that was missing, and I was coming to grip with this, but I was now up around 40, and I was employed in the state as a psychologist and doing with people, trying to be able to reassure them of how their thoughts and their feelings were unnecessary, but not being able to deal with the fact of why did they have it, other than for the common theories that existed at the time that, oh, it's your mothers and fathers who had their problems and therefore they caused your problems, this kind of a thing. And I would talk that kind of a thing as well with those who were seeing me in order to trace it back, and I would ask them if they were really taking a course that seemed wise for them, again using logic, this kind of approach, which was the common approach in healing in those times. And now I would begin this searching that there was another way, and I started to look at some of the alternative therapies. At that time there was some extreme kinds of therapies that had come out that I felt was meaningful, and it had to do with catharsis, that just look at what you're feeling, live it, feel it, and getting oriented to it, being able to feel this thing would be able to ease you up, that it wouldn't be such a strange, frightening kind of thing. And so it was a catharsis kind of thing. Just look at it, look at your problems, look at them, look at them, look at them. And this was the healing kind of approach to be able to take. And again, though, this was not necessarily going to be the way that happened, but a spiritual aspect had crept in. And this was going to be what I would start to follow. And now I would begin to use the technique of trying to be able to release my upsets, to talk them, yell them, howl them, whatever it is, to be able to get them out, catharsis, catharsis, catharsis on it. But it wasn't going to be enough. It doesn't tell you where is it coming from. And it drove me still further in the search of wanting now to be able to let go of these kinds of feelings, and that was going to lead me into the next step, that I would now become aware that there was something different inside myself as well, which needed to be looked at and which would provide me with help and hope. And that's what we'll talk about in this next segment. We've talked so far in these two parts about the path of healing, in which I mentioned how first I tried to be a doer, and then carried out this aspect, entered into counseling, tried to do what counseling is supposed to be, and that to look for healing within the counseling concepts and couldn't find it within it. It did not approach why do I have anxiety attacks. Now, if you remember, I spoke earlier about when in my own volunteer work, when people would come for the first meeting, I would realize that something has to be approached in order to be able to assist them to realize how you get onto the healing path. And this is where I was describing that I got placed onto the healing path, and I do that now with people when they come to be able to meet with me in my volunteer activities, that the first thing that I ask them when I say to them is that they need to become aware that there is another them, another you. And I ask them, have any of them had experiences of déjà vu? Now let me tell you what déjà vu is, because some of you would not know that. It's a French term, déjà vu. Déjà is the French word for already, and vu is the past tense of the verb to see. Déjà vu, already seen. And there were 3 members that day with whom we were working together with, and I asked them, have they had déjà vu experiences? And fortunately, all 3 of them did. And it's not surprising, because déjà vu is the most common of all the mystical or paranormal experiences that a person has. Some 7 out of 10 people who have had paranormal or mystical kinds of experiences will acknowledge that they have déjà vu experiences. It's the top one. And so I got each one to talk about their déjà vu experience, of how they knew of what was going to happen or what was going to be said at the moment, that they could realize, wait a minute, it's as though I've been through this before, or I have seen this before. And from that, there was the opportunity to point out, is this something that your human mind is usually capable of? Or is it something that all of a sudden occurs within the human experience? and they could realize that they didn't anticipate that that was coming. And indeed, with my own experiences, and I've never had deja vu myself, it's not mine. Mine is out-of-the-body experiences. I was taken out of the world. That this was to be my experience, which showed me that there was a different dimension. And the deja vu helped to show them there was a different dimension. And it was from this which intrigued them, because I could use that now to be able to ask them, when you are having a deja vu experience, what is the quality, the feeling state of your mind as you're in it? And they could acknowledge that it was just quiet and peaceful. One of them said, oh, there was a fear, but the fear came after the deja vu experience when they began to think of it. It was not present during the experience itself. It was not there. And in case some of you are wondering about what a deja vu experience is, I'll give you the experience of my late wife. That she was in nursing school, and she was in class that day, and the instructor walks in to the class with his white lab coat on, and she now knows that he's going to take out a cigarette, going to put it in his mouth, and he is going to take out a lighter, and try to get it going, and it would not work. And that he was going to take a second lighter, and it would not work, and a third lighter, and once again it would not work. At which point she then turned around and looked at the girl behind her, because she knew this girl was now going to get up and walk up to him and light a match for him and light a cigarette, which is what she did. And that girl got very startled when my wife looked at her, because she knew something unusual was happening at this point. That's deja vu. It's that you know you have lived or relived this experience that happened before. And so the fellas were intrigued with my asking them about deja vu and pointing out to them that this was a different mindset, that they were now in a different mind which had capabilities to it that their human mind did not have. It was something different, and when they were in it, there was no panicking. In fact, there was an intrigue and appreciation of what it was that was going on. That this becomes the starting point. And I would now have my starting point as well. That after I'm reading about Edgar Cayce and I want his powers, and I didn't realize that I was really praying the desire to have something that I didn't have and had no idea of how to be able to get. And I now have 2 out-of-the-body experiences in which I'm taking into the spirit dimension. My body is left behind, and in one of them I see the city out in space, and in the second one, days later, or maybe a couple of weeks later, I'm taken through a tunnel in which now at the end of it I see this light which reveals a symbolic, I'll just call it a symbol, of the Star of David, the 6-pointed star, and the cross, the Christian cross, coming out from the bottom point of the Star of David infused with it. And there came a feeling state that was with it. I now knew that this world was a lost world. I now knew that this was a sick world, that people did not live with each other in a feeling of love, in an experience of love. And I'm around 40 when I have this experience, and for 13 years I now enter into a different stage of life with a different feeling. I had a purpose now, and it was still, though, a doing purpose. I now had something to do that would replace all the other stuff that I was doing. I had to make a world in which we now would be able to live with each other from love, from sharing and caring for each other. I would now be in another phase of doing. Was there a conceptual framework within that? No. it was only as a doer I would now make a world, because I came back from those experiences with the knowledge that this world was indeed a lost world and a dangerous world that people did not love. If love is the simple giving away of a fullness, of a completeness to yourself, to another person, to help them to recover the fullness and completeness that's inside of them, that this is what love is, and that you need no confirmation of it. The other person doesn't have to approve of you. They can disagree, it doesn't make any difference. All you're interested in love is to give away, to be open to the other individual, that they can in some way or other receive the assurance from you that at least you're listening. So that love is the willingness to be able to expose yourself to whatever it is you need to give away or receive from the other person, which is helpful to others. And so I now wanted to make the world into one big commune. That this is what we would do, and it would be devoted now as my doing project, that in some way I could get this kind of thing going. Well, I couldn't get it going. And I wrote to all the leaders of all the nations about my idea that we would have a plow-sharing corps that people could adopt as a secondary approach to living, as an alternative approach rather to living, that they would want to join this like a monstrous Peace Corps, in which you're simply working to help being able to make a world in which we would feed, care for, and nourish all those who were in it. This was the thing that now drove me. It was a feeling state of wanting to be able to help people to be assisted in living in this world. For what reason? Didn't have the reason for it. Only knew it was necessary to make this world. And then next I would have to figure out, well, okay, then what's it for? What kind of a system? What is this going to be within this world of desiring to make it into one huge caring commune that would be enabling everybody that came into this world to live a life of being cared for and shared with and loved? Well, we'll go into that now in the next aspect. I had now been exposed to the fact that there was another dimension, and was introduced into the quality of that dimension. It was a dimension in which I now became aware that the world, our minds, and not so much our minds, that the world that we created, I would think more in that direction, the world that we created was an unloving world. It was not based on sharing and caring and love. It was not there. I became aware, and I was determined that's what we have to do. We have to produce a world which is loving and sharing. And so I came up with this concept, and you've read it in other areas of the YouTube, of a plow-sharing corps, that the world would provide the opportunity for an alternative way of living in which they would be devoted to creating the processes, the products that were needed to be able to care for every single human being that came into the world. But this brought another issue. Okay, you do that. For what? Because I'm aware you die. And so what are we living for? So that became the next issue that finally I was going to face up to, ever since when I was 7 or 8 years old and had the fear of death, and I saw myself, the solution for it was that I would be placed in the same coffin as my mom and dad, between the two of them, and I'd always be cared for and loved for. I have company, and that was it. So this was going to be the next stage, of which I would now have to look at as to what then is this world about. And from my studies I had majored, a major, I suppose, or a double minor, whatever it is. I had studied some 4 courses on religion within college, and therefore had some awareness of, for instance, the idea of being born again, and being born again in multiple lives, and which was called, and my mind goes blank on it, reincarnation. Thank you, my mind just unblanked. I was aware of the Eastern philosophy of reincarnation. Well, that fitted. I now, in some way or other, believed, okay, it's my turn now to be in this world and to try to make this world a better place, because I was thinking of my folks, that after all, they left this world when it wasn't such a hot place, but I would now make it a better place for my folks to come back into, and they would now have a better world, and they would now make it a better world, and then I would come back, and we would just go through this cycle of my folks and I going cycle, cycle, cycle. If you're saying, Bob, you're not too swift, are you? You're right, I was not too swift. However, I was trying to figure out the best way of handling the fact that I knew this world was a very lost world. I hadn't gotten around to seeing that the mind is a very lost mind that produced this world. That wasn't there yet. But that the world was a lost place, and solved the world doing this, and that solves everything. And so my orientation was to be able to try and make this loving aspect for the world. And it would creep into my work, because I never had trouble in seeing other people with a concern for them or a feeling of their pain, because I was working within facilities in which terrible tragedies had happened in people's lives, and terrible circumstances and terrible incidents of destructiveness had gone on. And I had feelings for these people that it wasn't to me, oh, it's them, that's what it is. I could feel what they were feeling at, because I had gone through all the same kinds of feelings of despair, desperation, of dependency on others to make us feel good and all. And here it was in people. And so I cared for them. And in later years, as I ran into the people who would have known me back then, they mentioned that they didn't know what my problems were, that they simply knew that I cared about them, which I did. I didn't see it, this is the patient, and this is me, the psychologist, this is the doctor, and this is the non-doctor. I didn't have that kind of feeling. I was just there for them, wanting to be able to be of help, knowing that in some way that they were facing the same troubles that I was facing, and in areas in which I also had my own destructiveness. I get married and I have children, and I'm still in this lost state of needing others to make me feel good. I could feel where they were coming from and their own despair at needing to feel good about themselves and being dependent on others. And if they weren't getting it, how you can either turn on yourself and get depressed, or turn on other people and be very aggressive towards them. And to even do that in nations, which is of course what we're watching as well today. The destructive human mind is present in all circumstances. So I now devote myself to making the Grand Commune, and it does not work, and I couldn't understand why doesn't it work. And I did not realize until later that the reason it doesn't work is because the folks were not in the same area as I was, in seeing how lost we all were, and knowing that its lostness is an individual experience from which we create a world that tries to deal with this lostness. And when I would put the idea of joining the commune, one of the things that I did, for instance, was with local groups. I would broach the idea of trying to form a community of housing in which we would have a different way of caring with people of developmental disabilities. And one of the reasons for it is my oldest son had developmental disabilities. And the way that commonly the society was dealing it with is they would build a supportive house. That's nice, put 10, 12 people in the house and care for them with 2 people, rather understaffing. And that this was how agencies made their funds to pay. The state supported this kind of a thing, and this kind of approach was utilized. And my approach was, no, take 2 or 3 families who would care together for 1 of 2 people. And this would give a broader experience, a less stressful way for the families to care for their person or for a group of people, where you're not having 12 people in one house cared for by 2, but you've got 12 people, if we can just use that example, taking care of 2. It was a reverse of it, and I raised it with local groups. And oh yes, there was support for this kind of idea. And the people with those with developmental disabilities wanted to be able to place their people within such a setting, but they themselves did not want to join in and be one of the caregivers. Out of luck, Robert. No such luck. And this existed in all the world. Oh sure, let's do that kind of thing, but they would not want to partake in it. Let somebody else do it, but not us. And so this would fail at the local locale, because people were not in a state of mind where they had abandoned the worth of the human mind and had a feeling of what a better mind would produce. And so the issue always stayed the same, that if the people did not know who they truly were, if their only alternative was to believe of themselves as the people that the society said they are, and to live for the values of the society, the family house, a car, 2 cars in the garage, a chicken in the pot, as the whole meaning of life, the physical well-being, and in taking care of our own needs at the expense of whatever you got to do in order to get for yourself. It's a survival orientation. You just could not get the world to change. And this was what I needed to be able to get into, to realize there still had to be something different. And that difference is what we're going to go into next. You're following these various phases of the topic about the healing path, and the very personal one that it was for me that I've been presenting to you. That all of these plans were based on a personal doing. The final one finally having an introduction into what I would call a spiritual aspect to it, that there was a different me, that I had experienced what I now would refer to as my soul, that I'm taken out of this world and I'm being shown the dimension of this world, and of it bringing to me the idea that I can produce that dimension myself in this world by simply wanting to set up a community based on the principles. But it never worked. It couldn't work because people were still in their survival-oriented mind, and although they loved the idea of it to help out with family members who needed care, to send them to such a place, they themselves did not want to work in such a place. That human mind, that survival orientation, the requirement for the change into a giving aspect rather than the getting one, would destroy the absolutely destroy the possibility of ever creating a society or a community that followed these principles. And so something more was needed. And I would now be taken into the next dimension. I had shown this idea, this plan of a plow-sharing corps for people to work as an alternative lifestyle, to live for the care and the well-being of everybody, rather than a living for survival and making sure you can make it, even if it's at the expense of other people. I had shown this to a colleague, and who said to me that this really was a spiritual approach, and I was approaching it from a secular approach, that I was going to all the countries of the world and to their leaders, and in the United States I had mailed out a copy of it to all the governors and all the Congress people and the senators and the president, had done everything possible in order to encourage the discussion of this plan. And it didn't work. No such luck at all. No such luck. Nor did it work at a very low level, I'll call it low level, a small level of in the local community. When I would approach it to people who had people with developmental disability, folks in part of their own family, they welcomed the thought of taking care of them in such a circumstance, but would not join it. It was impossible for people who believed in the presence of the human mind and of the reality of the human mind and no other reality. There was no way they could do it. And I didn't realize that I had experienced the fact that I saw the human mind's productions as worthless, that we were living in a world which was destructive, which was not based on caring, but it was based on, I gotta survive at no matter what. And my thought was that at least if I'm existing within a world in which I get cared for and shared with, that I would welcome the idea of giving it back. But I had reached a stage where the other people who I was approaching were not there yet. They were not there. It was a self-centered, surviving world. And at least if I was in that kind of world, it would be the end of my anxiety attacks, because I'm not concerned anymore with the uncertainties of doing, the uncertainties of what could exist, of how I would live. I was not faced any longer with the instabilities of the kinds of civilizations and communities that we set up, but I thought the solution was in setting up the circumstances which would provide the ability to care for and end my personal anxiety attacks and worries, which was all the basis of that feeling unappreciated and feeling that I'm unworthy of ever producing this kind of a lifestyle, and unworthy to even think that I would be able to assist or help others because of this low feeling that I had that these anxiety attacks would cause. It just separated me, it isolated me from doing this, but I could solve the world problem and that would solve my human problem. And it was not to go that way. And this friend came along who told me that this is something that's of a spiritual idea. And here I am. Now, I had four courses, if you remember, when I went to college in religions, and I loved the religions professor. Blessed man, in fact, let me give credit, Dr. Professor Robert Perry at NYU. God bless that man, that he was so warm and would give me a background of feeling security there. And also, I'm going to mention the Mrs. Tehila Lichtenstein, who was in charge of the Jewish Science, which my mother had attended. She had looked for help herself in the area of healing. And so I had some small association with Jewish Science that Mom and Dad would take me up to an occasional meeting there, and I met Mrs. Lichtenstein and had a very deep appreciation and very deep love for her. A lovely, lovely person who, when I would come up with some of my ideas, how she would say to the audience in the little gathering after the services, "Oh, listen to Robert, he has such wonderful ideas." And I'm ranting and raving from a typical guy who's just blatting away wanting to be able to talk about this kind of stuff, and she was always so receptive to it. Mrs. Lichtenstein, certainly you are in the kingdom. Thank you, dear, for everything that you represented in the times where I'm going to have to get ready for the changeover, which would occur in some years later. But wonderful support for this. And I bring the idea of the Plowsharing Corps to the late assistant rector of our local church, and again I would want to give credit to it, the Father Ken Newquist, who has passed away, and he looked at this idea, and he asked me how I had come up with it, and I told him of these experiences of seeing that community, that city out in space, and then the Star of David and the cross fused with each other. And he asked me, how do you interpret that? And I said, that's Judaism and Christianity combined together to make this world of the Plowsharing Corps. And he said, I see it differently. And you might have seen, I might have repeated this experience before in other segments of it. I said, oh really? How did you see it? And he said, well, this is the ultimate Christian community that you have described. And I said, thank you. I hope you'll let some Jewish people live there. I wasn't Christian. I was out of a Jewish family. And he said, and by the way, I see that the symbol is something that is the representation of the Christ. And I immediately said to him, and I leave out the unkind words that I said, you see it your way, I'll see it my way. He said, by the way, he said, you're going to have more of those experiences. And I made the unkind remark you're full of, I'll let you fill in words, that I have had these experiences some 13 years ago, haven't had one since, and left, and you wouldn't believe it, but he and I became very good friends, and he really saw what my destination was in spirituality. I was a teacher of prayer, and he was the first one who spotted this and spoke of this kind of a thing. He said, you'll see, more is coming. And as I said, you're full of, and I left. And no, he wasn't full of it. He was full of the awareness of spiritual approach. And I would now have the experience that I witnessed the appearance of Jesus to me. Had this experience and would now lead into the deeper awareness of what it was all about. And we'll go into that in the next aspect. Well, we're in deeper and deeper into this area of my personal path of healing, which I've been talking about because I do so believe that it's relevant to yourself. And we've now come to the point where, from secularism and the following of where everybody says you should be and living a life from that, through the various aspects of a slow approach of knowing that there is another alternative to deal with anxiety attacks, and for all of us, be they anxiety attacks, be it depression, being it a very troubled thinking mind, be it relationships, be it circumstance, doesn't make any difference, that we're talking about the approach that occurs when we come into this world as human beings and then have to grow into the awareness of what is this all about, from just doing to survive to finding that there is an identity and a purpose to you, which is your mission. Well, we're into that aspect now. Finally, God appears to me. God appears to me in the identity of Jesus, and years after that as Mary, that Jesus in the Trinitarian concept is one with God, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. That concept and Mary also comes into the phase because she has been ignored, and Mary is Mother God. That when God comes into this world, God has to come in as an identity that is relevant to the people that are in this world believing in themselves as bodies. So God does very simply that Jesus comes in to represent the male, and Mary comes in to represent the female, so that there is a relating of how we have created bodies as the identity to believe in, rather than our souls as the personal self that we are and that everybody is. So Mary and Jesus become this kind of an identity, and it's going to lead with me to a Judeo-Christian identity. The experience that I have in which Jesus appears, I began as what seemed like a dream, that I enter this room. I walk into this house and enter this room, and I see in front of me a rocking chair. And the chair begins to rock as I'm looking at it, and I get very unnerved by seeing that chair rock. And I figure the solution is I need to stop it from rocking. And so I move upon the chair and I grab it by its two arms. It was like a wooden rocking chair. And I grab the two arms to stop it from rocking, and this incredible electrical force runs through me, which freezes me into place like I would have stuck my finger in an electric socket in the wall or something. And I am frozen into place, cannot move, am simply frozen into place. And then this entire experience disappears, and in its place I suddenly am looking at like a movie screen, and a face appears upon it. And at first I thought that it was the face of an American Indian. It was sharply sculptured kind of face, long kind of face, kind of rectangular type of face. But the intriguing part of the face were the eyes that I looked upon. Those eyes, and I'll imitate it, were looking past me, looking over my right shoulder rather than looking at me. It was looking at my right shoulder and as though leaning forward or some way. But I could look at those eyes and I saw the depth that was in those eyes, the fullness of the stare of those eyes as it was looking past me. But combined with that stare, there was also, I sensed, a determination that there was something that that person wanted to do. And I gazed upon it, and then it faded away, and the experience was over. I come out of it, and now my head, the top of it, is just taking off in this electrical current that was in me, that the head was just, I want to say the word sizzling, but I haven't got another word for it at this point, but the vibration of energy going through the top of my head was there, and it would stay for weeks, slowly fading down, fading down, fading down, that there was something in me that had something to do with my touching it. Well, when I came out of it, I knew that I had gazed upon the face of Jesus, and it was shown to me. And I shared it with the chaplain, who was a good friend of mine at the facility where I worked, and his name was Father John Eyrick, and who also knew, as I mentioned earlier, Father Ken Newquist of the Episcopal faith, and mentioned it as well to Rabbi Port, who had formerly been the rabbi in the synagogue in Middletown, and who I was friendly with. And here I was, a Jewish person, looking upon a Christian identification of God. And I told it to Rabbi Port, and he said a Jewish person can believe anything that they wish. They're a Jewish person. And that gave me a support to lean on it, and it would eventually enable me to meet Rabbi Schwab here in Middletown, and between him and Father Newquist and Father Eyrich, we formed a group of people that was teaching interfaith kinds of activities, and the various congregations came together, members of the congregations came together from this in order to be with themselves, as well as Islamic, because there was a chaplain at where I worked who was Imam Abdul Qadir, and later on Salahuddin Muhammad, and all of these people were chaplains at the psychiatric center where I was the head of psychology. And this was to begin one of the activities that came out of this. I felt that what had happened with me, I had to be able to incorporate it within my identity. That there was the Star of David, and there was the Christian cross. And so what I did is I decided that I would be baptized. And in doing so, I spoke with the rector of the Episcopal Church here in Middletown, who simply, I picked the church because these were people who I knew at work, were chaplains, and the member of my own psychology department who had introduced me to them, and had no knowledge of one Christian religious denomination from another, but I would become baptized. And I said to them, I want to be perfectly clear that I am not coming in order to convert, but rather from what I have seen, I am meant to fuse. And it was accepted. And I would then be able to begin on my mission for whatever it was within that, and it would proceed from there. Well, what now began to happen is that I began to study prayer life. I had never prayed before 53. I was now 53 when all of this occurred. I had never prayed, and I began to read books on prayer. I had asked for recommendations on books about prayer and began to read about it and began to utilize prayer. A solution now had occurred to what I was looking for. I was trying to build a world that would practice care and loving and sharing with each other, but that wasn't the solution, because the person needed to want to be a representative, would want to have a feeling about what this was all about inside of themselves. And in the next aspect that I'm going to talk about here, I want to talk about the inside versus the outside experience of God's presence and of the effect on prayer life and the development of prayer life. Next segment. We're down now to what all of this was leading to in terms of the finding of spiritual identity and the knowledge of healing. God had enabled me to have happen the realization of the presence of God and of that God within me. This is what had been missing all along, was that there was a completeness about myself, a feeling of being lovable, of having worth. It existed within me, but I was looking outside of me. I was looking at activities that one had to do with others as the way to be able to feel good. But I could not feel good within inside myself because I didn't have that identity within inside of myself, that beingness, that portion of me, that soul of me, which was my essence, and I was unaware of it, and it was blocked off. It was simply blocked off. So now let me give an explanation here as to what is going on and what I realized. As part of my studies, I became aware of A Course in Miracles, very, very important book that came into my life and which enabled me to meet the Reverend John Mundy, who I would work with in terms of the concepts of A Course in Miracles, and had been a book that was dictated by Jesus to Dr. Helen Schuchman, a psychologist at Columbia University's School of Physicians and Surgeons, and to Dr. William Thetford, who was the head of the psychology department. And they received this book, they channeled this book by Jesus, which to this day I believe is about the most advanced book on the understanding of who we are, what this world is about, what the next world is. And so the healing basis, it presents a very full picture. And so this became also an important study for me, as well as the studying of prayer life that I saw in other books, the standard books of the mystical portions of Christianity, people who heavily were invested in meditation and prayer. All of this now would begin to be part of my understanding of who I was. Who was I? I am a soul. I am a godly being. Jesus would say to me, there be but one truth. Ye are gods, and ye are loved. Ye are gods, and ye are loved. Which means everything and anything else that I believe about myself, which is not you are a god and you are loved, is false. Everything else is false. There is but one truth. We are gods, and we are loved. God made us like God in identity and in the qualities that we live from, which is loving. I now had the feeling state within me that this was true, not to settle the world outside me, but to give of this inner state of the being of a loving person away to others who were looking as well to have a sense of strength, of identity, of a knowledge about ourselves that is complete, that is one with God. In fact, the prayer that is such a favorite of mine that I reach for is that I want you as me. I want God as me. I want that. I want the God state to be me, because God made me as a godly being. I am the fulfillment, the completion of God, other than the fact that I'm not the original creator, that's only God. But God made us like unto himself and herself, because I told you before that Mary also was shown to me to be the female part of godliness, that they came into the world in order to match this world of male and female. I now know, feel within inside myself that I am a completion, that there is a oneness of me with God, that God is me in all fullness, that I will permit God to show God to me, and I have no worries, I have no uneasiness, I have no sense of unworthiness, I have no sense of loneliness, I have a sense of wanting to be able to give away the recovery of this inner awareness, the recovery of the awareness of our God being. We are gods and we are loved. We are gods and we are loved, and the problem that exists for each and every one of us is that has been hidden. But until it is to be recovered, we are in difficulty with the loss of awareness of who we are and of the state of mind that is available to us underneath this mask of the human state. We are gods, we are eternal beings, there is no death. We are gods, there is no sickness within us, except if we want to believe that there's something different other than what the truth is. We're gods and we're loved. There are no colds or sniffles within God. There are no migraine headaches. There are no upset stomachs. There are no cancers. Nothing like that within God and within God's children, if we choose to be able to live the life, the existence of what God says. Ye are gods and ye are loved. I don't slip you anything except I slip you. You're a godly being just like me. You haven't got to worry, nothing. You're complete in my love of you, and I remain with you no matter where you are or what you believe. You can't interfere with the oneness that I am with you in the totality of love, of feeling. It is the state of consciousness which now rises up every single time you want it. Now, does that mean, aha, wonderful, all problems are over, you never feel anxiety, you never feel depression, etc.? No, not so. The problem is that God doesn't say, "Unk, I now knock out your awareness of yourself as a body. I just knock it out, you will never feel it again." God doesn't do that, because to the extent that you want to continue to go ahead and deal with the fact that you choose to believe that you're a body, that you choose to believe this alternative life that you're living, this denial of the truth of who you are, one with God and one in God's love of you. We are gods and we are loved. We have walked away from that. That's why you're not aware of it. That's what has been this whole testimonial that I've been talking about. I had no awareness of this. Where did it go? God sat with me every single moment, having all kinds of experiences, hint, 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 of what is there. But it was me who was choosing not to believe in how I was made and coming up with an alternative option that I am the center. I am the one who is the center of action, of belief. It's me who's to pull off stuff, etc. And in order to do that, excuse me, God, but just would you move over a little bit, please, God? Thank you very much. The camera's on me, not on you, God. This is what I did with God. I chose to experience myself as different. Why? Because there was one thing that I wasn't. God creates us all in His likeness and image, except we are not what? The original creator. Oh ho ho. You can guess from there what goes on. Well, I'd like to be an original creator. Well, thanks a lot, God, for creating me. I know, I want you to know I appreciate it very much, if you don't mind. I'll see you later. You go ahead. I'll join you for supper later. I'll see you. And off we go in order to be able to make of ourselves a substitution in which now we have everything. That's the story, by the way, of Adam and Eve. That God said, don't eat of the tree of good and evil, and don't eat of the tree of life in the garden, or else you'll know yourself different. Well, we did it. And so we now eat of the tree of good and evil, and we now come up with a different alternative existence, which we will now be the center of it. And we walk away from God. We're now out into a world where we're not aware of the God as us. Not aware of it. Haven't got it. God just sits there, doesn't clunk us on the head, and waits, because God knows that this is something that is incomplete, that is disasterville, because we have lost our sense of identity, of our oneness, of the loving quality that is true us, and we have made a creation in which we're not eternal beings. We are bodies, needing to survive in a world that we will do anything to hold on to this bodily being, because we have lost the awareness of who we truly are, and so this becomes the reality instead of the godly reality. That has to be settled as we move along in this problem and in the next phase that we will talk about. In this last segment, I want to start off with the reality that God granted to us existence of life. As Jesus put it, life is in the spirit, the body is nothing. And in the readoption, in the recovery of our spirit beings that is one with God, there are no problems. God created us to be problem-free. That once we experiment with free will and the making of a different alternative, such as bodies, which God says is nothing, they're nothing. It's just something we're playing with. It's an imagined concept. That once we're done playing with this kind of stuff and recognize the misery that enters into the loss of the awareness of our loving nature in oneness with God, we are in the deepest of trouble, fearful, survival-oriented, because we have lost the awareness of godly self and of the eternal life that is our soul. And so the secret for our healing, and that's behind all of these dictations that we've been involved in with each other, is to be willing to let God help us recover our eternal being, to recover the awareness that we are souls playing that we are humans. And in order to accomplish that, God must show that to you. You must see your divine self. We're back again to the example of deja vu, which shows you that there is another being other than yourself that is inside you. Or with my out-of-body experiences, I see my soul that has an identity and an issue, and that even when God appears before it any number of times, I'm at peace. I feel loved. I feel cared for. I feel I belong. Every twist of the human state is gone. Gone. It's not relevant anymore. I recognize that this is the lostness of what I'm feeling. It's the state of lostness, of substitution, because I wanted to be able to create, to experiment with being my own God, and a creation in which God gets shunted aside. But I've reached the point where I did not like the miseries of it. I did not like the anxiety attacks. I did not like the feeling of dependency on others to feel liked. I did not want the feeling of an unworthiness, of a loneliness, of a fear of there being nothing to hold on to, nothing anywhere to hold on to, no relationship, nothing makes me let go, nothing enables me to feel the abandonment of this, to feel the alternative of it, until I permitted, I opened up. God enabled me to open up, because I couldn't do it myself. I could only know despair. but I permitted, by the despair that I was feeling, for God to now move on me because I wouldn't object to it. And God knew how to get it to me and yet have me feel safe. Not that it's a loss of my sense of self if I'm going to give up the belief that the human is the important creature of me, but that it's something else, that there's no fear of letting it go because I got something that's better, that I wanted, that stopped the anxiety attacks, that stopped the self-doubt. I was being shown steadily that I am a God being made in the image of my Creator, which is pure, unconditional love. That's all that I am. That's all that you are, unconditional love. And how do you find it out? Bob, I want to find it out. Look, okay, you say you got the yes, I like what you're talking about. How do you do it? Got to pray it. It's not enough to read Scripture. It's not enough to read A Course in Miracles. It's not enough to read the very great books that exist from the mystics of all traditions. It's not enough. It's the asking of God to help you apply what you're reading. That when you read from God, of God's loving nature, when you read of God saying, love yourself as I have loved you, God, okay, I'll do that. That won't do it. That won't do it. Because your human side says, you could do that. No deal. It has to be prayed. You cannot bring unto yourself the healings. All you can bring is a conscious awareness of the fact that you want to be helped. You've got to the point where you realize, I haven't got answers and I'm very anxious over this. And either you're depressed or you're blaming others and your relationships are off because of that, or circumstances become overwhelming. To be able to deal with this needs a prayer. Lord, I want your help. I just read this here, that I'm supposed to love others as you have loved me. I haven't got the slightest idea how to do that. I don't know what to do. Lord, I ask your help to enable me to love others as you have loved me, which means you're going to let go. You're going to let go. You're going to be willing to be empty at that point, because the only way that God gets into you is if there's an empty space. That's the way God gets to you. But by asking to be able to be helped to become what your readings about love and about caring, of what it means, you need to be able to ask God's help, and you're giving God permission to be able to do this. Now, you've most likely read in other areas of our YouTube site that I lean on 4 prayers, which I find to be helpful for you when you now have got to the point where you can sense God's presence and God's working with you. If you're in trouble with yourself, if you're depressed, if you're feeling inadequate, if you're feeling guilty over your past, if you feel you haven't got the strength for the future, if you feel that I failed and I'm worried about failing, you're down on yourself. The prayer that I use with myself when these feelings can hit at times, God, let me see myself only as you see me. Let me be the self that you know me to be. I cannot do it myself. I need it from you. And God then is enabled to let you feel this godly self that you are, bit by bit by bit, very, very gently. Never to overwhelm you, never to give you too much, and certainly not to give you too little, but knows the perfect bit of element that is relevant for that moment to give it to you. The second prayer is when you're in trouble with other people, with the way you feel about others, where you're judgmental of them, critical of them, they're so unappreciative of me, oh, this is the way they are, and you're angry at them. Actually, it's your need of them that causes the problem, and it's still with you, but still you're thinking of others. That Jesus again states, let me help you see others the way I see them. He states, love others as yourself. Love others as yourself. There is a oneness that you are with them. And you now would be able to turn to prayer when you feel angry, displeased with other people, and resentful of how they treat you. Lord, let me see others as you see them, and let me respond to them as you would want me to respond in this moment. It's in that moment. Or you're in trouble with how you feel about God, and you think God's down on you. The prayer becomes, Lord, help me to see you as you know yourself to be, not how I want to see you, but as you want me to see yourself. That's prayer 3 with God. And finally, circumstances are bad. The economy of the world, the hardships, the difficulties of needing to survive, the terrible tragedies that occur physically in the world, of tsunamis, of hurricanes, of earthquakes, of fires, all the things that are from this unstable world of bodily being. Lord, help me to handle this moment now as you want me to handle it, whatever it is. Employment circumstances, in school, you're taking exams, whatever it is. Help me to handle this moment now as you want me to. You need to be able to let go of your human mind, which is so destructive towards yourself and towards others, towards your relatedness even with God, and towards circumstances in which you're going to aggressively believe that you know how to answer the problems to this, and you're going to make moves of it. God says, no. Let me help you. The prayer needs to be, I hand this moment to you with the circumstance that is going on, to be able to look upon it and handle it as you would, and go into that emptiness. That's the 4 prayers. Let's pause again now as the end of this chapter on my personal discussions with you as we move on to other areas. I hope that my testimonial, my personal testimonial is helpful to you, that God had me all along, but just had to wait for me to let go of Bob Wellman in order to recover Bob of God. And once that happened, I now know that all my uncertainty and anxieties were occurring in the absence of feeling the perfect being at peace that God had made me, and to know I can recover it at any time while I'm in this world, to feel good again in this moment, and also to teach others how to get there, because God only wants one thing to happen. You are God's, and you are loved. I want you home. I want you to awaken from this imagined state that you're in and recover the awareness of how I love you and how you love me, and you exist in a creation of total love amongst all of my children, made one with each other in love. That's the truth, and God intends to get you there, and God has the capability to get you there. And you would have the wish to get there. Bless your hearts that we're chugging along with each other. Bye-bye for now.